Hello, my name is David Paterson. I'm a teacher of chemistry and physics at Oldham School outside Elstree in London. I'm going to talk a bit about integrated instructions in practical work, how I develop them, how I use them in my classroom, some of the research I've done and published, and the resources I've made available for practical work in the secondary classroom. So, started. So this work came about from work I'd been doing in the classroom anyway. I was lucky enough to be awarded a small grant and support by the RSC Chemical Education Research Group. So thanks to them for the support, which really helped push me on to think about how to research this in a bit more detail, rather than just using it and talking about it with colleagues. And this ultimately culminated in this paper being published in Journal of Chemical Education last year. So thanks to the group for the sponsorship. Suzanne Fergus and Michael Seary were my mentors for the year, and they were very useful collaborators to talk to about my developing research themes. The staff and students at Oldham School, and Steve Jones and Bob Worley, who have allowed me to use their resources and also bounce ideas off in terms of the microscale aspect of integrated instructions. So the outline of the talk is relatively simple. I would imagine most people have some understanding of the idea of working memory and long-term memory and cognitive load. So I'll just go through some of the basics on that. I'll look a little bit about extraneous load in practical work and where the issues of engaging well with practical work come from. Which really lead on to the idea of integrated instructions. Some of the results I've collected, and the publication will obviously have fuller details on that, and then some of the resources I've put out on my personal blog. So in terms of working memory and why it's hard for anyone to learn something new, these ideas have been around for a long time. Michael Seary pointed out Johnson, who is obviously very famous in science circles with his ideas about the chemistry triplet, was talking about working memory and how to make it practical work effective and the like decades ago. So back in the 1970s and 1980s, he was working on this and thinking about how the practical classroom can be very challenging for students. And he published this article in Chemistry, Education in Chemistry back in '82, talking about the working memory and how the lab environment can be a very overwhelming environment for students to learn in. And this really comes down to the fact our working memory is limited, and if we're having to think about multiple things, so many different new things, and bringing that all together to understand what's going on, the ability to learn is severely limited. So some of the things that might be expected to be thought about in our working memory when we're doing practical work is the theory, which underlies what the practical is about, the skills, maybe we're learning new skills, the verbal instructions, if we haven't had that on our instruction sheet and we kind of call out, oh, don't forget to use this reagent, or this is where we put things at the end of the practical. The input from the experiment itself, so what we're actually expecting the students to learn from the practical and the data that they are collecting, recalling skills, the written instructions themselves, and obviously all the apparatus. So these ideas have been around for a long time, and there's been this new wave of using cognitive theory and cognitive load theory to examine our work in the classroom of late. And so it's good to know that these ideas, you can go back through the literature and find good ideas from the past. So the basics of long-term memory and working memory. So this is the Atkinson-Shiffrin model updated by Baddeley in the 90s to include or to change short-term memory into working memory, and very basic ideas that we have all of this input into our sensory memory from our eyes and ears and taste and all the other senses, and the majority of that information gets dumped out. Because if we had to process all of that, we'd be completely overwhelmed. So our sensory memory then shunts what we are paying attention to into our working memory, And we can keep stuff, we can keep information in our working memory if we're rehearsing it, like when we're trying to remember a number, code to a door or a mobile phone number. But if we don't attend to that information and make links with information that we already know, then we tend to forget it out of our working memory. If we are going to remember something, it needs encoding into our long-term memory. And then if we're going to use that information later on, we need to be able to retrieve it from the long-term memory. And the process of, or the size of that long-term memory is much larger than our working memory, but if we don't attend to or retrieve information from our long-term memory, at some point it's potentially forgotten over time. So basically, this idea of the working memory as where we're consciously thinking, the key thing is its limited capacity, and if we are overloading working memory, then task completion is impeded and students aren't able to learn because they can't process the new information, the new ideas or skills that we're trying to teach them. How is information encoded into the long-term memory? So this is where we come to the idea of schema, and the example I like to use when talking about this is the idea of how we would expect students to follow this instruction. If we ask them to heat 100 cubic centimeters of water at 50 degrees Celsius, underlying those, to us, simple instructions is a huge amount of prior knowledge that they need to be able to access. And specifically, they need to know which equipment to use and how to set it up. So when you have a novice in the classroom and you ask them to do this, this is a highly complex task for them because they don't necessarily know about tripods and gauzes and Bunsen burners and thermometers and all that. If you, however, ask a year 11 student or a sixth form student that exact same instruction, then they've been introduced to all this equipment. They know about heating, they know about the different colours of flames and the like. And so that information has been contained within the idea of how to heat water. So if they're retrieving that information, that's schema of heating water, that then just occupies one slot, if you like, in the working memory. And therefore, they're not going to be as overloaded as a year 7 student who, trying to tackle this seemingly simple task to us, is completely overwhelming to them because their limited working memory is held up or is has got the information of a beaker as a separate idea and a tripod as a separate idea and a gauze as a separate idea. And so the idea of them being able to put it all together and complete the task is impeded by the fact that all of these are separate bits of information. By learning it, by developing over the years and trying out these things multiple times, the idea of heating or the equipment to heating has been brought together into one chunk of information, one schema which they can retrieve and use so that they can apply those skills much more effectively. So cognitive load theory talks about what's happening in the working memory and why our working memories can become overloaded. And so it's split down into the traditional model of cognitive load theory has intrinsic, extraneous and germane load. Intrinsic load is about the complexity of concepts and how they're related to each other. Extraneous load is to do with how the instructions may be presented to the students and external influences. And germane load is this idea about using the load or using the our working memory and the space in the working memory to build those schema, to make those schema more complex and more all-encompassing as we learn new information. So if we work on the assumption that our cognitive load is limited, all of these loads, the intrinsic, extraneous and germane, are going to be filling up that load. The analogy here is the measuring cylinder. Ideally, we want to reduce extraneous load as much as possible because that will allow us to have more room in our working memory. Intrinsic load is trickier to deal with because some concepts are intrinsically complex, and this is where we get to the idea of breaking complex things down into simpler ideas and working up to more complex ideas. But ideally, we want to have as much space in the working memory as possible for the germane load, for them to be able to understand what they're doing and develop their schema, make their understanding of new concepts more sophisticated. So this is obviously very broad brush ideas about cognitive load, and you can spend a lot longer going into this. But where I came from in terms of developing integration instructions was this idea of how do we make instructions simpler? How do we make instructions less overwhelming, reduce extraneous load to make students be able to engage better with the practical work, get into this idea of Abraham's of having their minds on during the practical work as well as hands-on. So the classic example I use when talking about this is the classic electrolysis experiment. So this is the Nuffield setup. We're asking them to electrolyze salt water to produce hydrogen and chlorine, and then test the gases to prove that when you electrolyze salt water, you get these two products. But I've watched enough students over the years when I use this equipment, if this is the first time I do electrolysis, that their ability to think about what's going on in terms of the chemistry, the microscale, sorry, not the microscale, the submicroscopic ideas of the electrolysis is severely limited by a lot of stuff that doesn't impede me because I'm an relative expert in this electrolysis. I've done it before. I know what the problems are. I can attend to what's going on, which is collecting the gas and testing it. But the students themselves might well be attending to all sorts of other things. Have they collected enough gas? How do they get the test tubes filled with the salt water beforehand? Have they got the Boston clamp right? It's a complex bit of equipment for a novice. Are the power packs working? Have they got the plugged in right? Are they short-circuiting it? Are they spilling the salt water out of the big glass tube? Are they going to electrocute themselves? All of these things that they're worrying about, along with in the days when we had practical work in classrooms in the traditional way, dealing with all the people around them and all the peer pressure and all the noise, all of those things. If they are attending to those in their working memory, the chances of them dealing with and thinking about the underlying chemistry is quite limited. So one of the things we can do is reduce that extraneous load, simplify equipment, and this is where microscale chemistry comes in. You can do electrolysis in just a droplet of water in a Petri dish with a couple of graphite rods or carbon fiber rods. And so you're stripping away a lot of the extraneous load in terms of the complex equipment and them just fitting equipment together and making it work. So this simplifies what they have to focus on. They're just looking at a small area of chemistry. It's very simple to set up. It's quick to check to make sure everything's working. And so they've got more of a chance to physically stand there and look at the equipment, see the results they're getting, and think and talk about the chemistry that's going on in front of them. In terms of integration instructions, it comes with this idea of the split attention effect. So this is a nice diagram from a journal article by Jenkins in School Science Review a couple of years ago. And the split attention effect basically says if the student is having to attend to information in two separate places, they are spending some of their cognitive load jumping between those sources. So on the left-hand diagram, you've got the instructions overlaid on the picture, so they can just look at that diagram. On the right-hand side, it's the traditional labeling, and they're having to jump between the key and the diagram to see what's going on. So potentially that's adding extra load that they are not having to, therefore that cognitive load is not available for them to be thinking about the concepts and developing their schema. So where did integration instructions come from? Well, it turns out, as ever with lots of these things, you know, people have had these ideas before, and there's prior research on this, which was useful when developing my own ideas. But I realized that I'd been doing these kind of integrated instructions for a while in the classroom, and just the project allowed me to kind of formalize it a bit. And this idea that if you are giving students just lists of instructions and potentially a diagram, it's hard for them to see what they're doing in their mind's eye about what the practical looks like. And so Deshri and others, mainly with university undergraduates, but some secondary as well, put these instructions together. So you have arrows pointing about where solutions go. You simplify the instructions to make it much easier for the student to carry out the practical work and therefore make the observations and think about the chemistry that's going on. So this is a classic practical that I talk about with integrated instructions, how we make copper sulfate crystals. It's a very complex practical. It takes a long time to carry out in the lesson. There's lots of equipment involved. It can take quite a long time, and you normally don't get to the end point within the lesson because it's quite a long and involved practical. So this is one of the first ones I developed in terms of integration instructions. It's a slightly different practical. It doesn't heat up the acid with the Bunsen. The heating comes later on to concentrate the solution. But the basics of the integration instructions are there. Much more simplified instructions, arrows pointing to where chemicals and equipment are moved, and pictograms like the eyes to say show precisely where we are making observations. So when I did this practical with my students, they were getting to the crystals within 20-25 minutes, which is much different from the larger scale practical, the traditional way of doing it, where you are generally leaving the evaporating dishes until several days later for the students to see the crystals, by which time potentially the learning points are not as strong because it's a long time since they've done that practical. So I collected some data on this. I started blogging about it, and EIC asked me to write an article on what the kind of key ideas around integration instructions were. And so this is from the article in EIC a couple of years ago. And the key ideas were about keeping the equipment to a minimum, making the instructions as simple as possible, and numbering them, preferably clockwise or anti-clockwise, with tick boxes so they can track their progress. Keeping those the pictograms, using those pictograms to show where the observations are carried out. And generally, I project these instructions up on the screen, and they get a paper copy for themselves so they can stick it into their books, and they've got that record of it right there for them. I put out some of the templates I used on my blog a couple of years ago, and Chemix at the moment is become quite popular for doing this. The chap who codes this has done a great job of producing diagrams really simple, so that's available as well. So I use it with microscale as well. It's one of my favorite techniques in terms of carrying out practical work. So this one is just a neutralization between citric acid and sodium carbonate, and everything is just within this droplet of water. They're just moving a few crystals of each of the solid into the center with the universal indicator, and then they just have to stand there or sit there and watch the chemistry unfold in front of them. So not faffing around, not needing to move around the classroom. They can sit and watch and just see the acid diffuse and the alkali diffuse across the across the drop, and then they can see the bubbles being produced if they're patient enough. So when I was doing the actual research project, I was starting to produce worksheets that they were then asked questions about their observations, what they understood in terms of the techniques, the steps of the techniques they carried out. So really understanding or asking questions about what they understood about the chemistry and what they understood about why they did particular steps. We did a crude oil distillation, and I think I did one other as well in the paper that got published. So the key take-home points from the data that I collected, all of my students were completing their practical work. In terms of the questions they were asking, and this was one of the drivers for producing integration instructions in the first place, was getting the students to be independent of when carrying out this practical work, not continually coming back to me saying, what do I do next? What do I do next? And a lot of the time was just, go on to step 4, go on to step 5, but they didn't seem to be able or willing to follow that through with the traditional instructions. On average, they were asking a few questions, only one impractical question for every 2 students, and the majority of those questions still were refer back to the instructions. And it was very easy because I was standing at the front with it projected on the board, and I could just point to which instruction is next. And mostly they got the idea that I wasn't going to tell them what to do next. It was literally just tick the box, follow through, and work this out for yourself. You've got everything you need in front of you. Their answers to the observation questions were mostly partially appropriate, so I just coded these as inappropriate, appropriate, or partially appropriate. So it's not the magic bullet, and none of these things are a magic bullet. Some of them still weren't making the observations I thought they would be making, but one of the advantages of practical work being done quicker because there was less of the kind of back and forward of trying to get them to do the practical. There was more time in the lesson for us to come together as a group and discuss the observations. I could show pictures of, you know, good quality observations so that we can talk about the chemistry behindhand. Variable responses to the reasons for the practical steps. So again, this is, you know, all part of their training as a chemist. They might not necessarily understand why they've done step 3 or why they've done step 4, but again, I can I've got more time in the class for them to talk about those things and learn those things afterwards. In terms of their opinions on the integration instructions, I use a Likert scale 1 to 5 in terms of how easy they found the practical work, and they were all ranking it 1 to 3, so very easy, easy, or neither easy, not, or not easy. In terms of their written feedback, there was quite a lot of indication that they liked the clarity of the instructions. They could see what they were supposed to be doing. So I liked the first comment. It helped me do the practical without asking the teacher, gave them that intrinsic motivation. They could do it themselves rather than having to refer to the external expert. And this idea of confidence, they knew that they were doing the right thing because they could see that the equipment was like what it was on the diagram, so they had more confidence to carry on through the practical. For me, the key thing was I was spending a lot less time dealing with what Johnson called these thoughtless questions. Questions that if the student, you know, sat down and spent maybe 10 more seconds thinking about it, they probably could have worked out what to do, but not learned helplessness. But sometimes you do get students who are just like, what do I do next? What do I do next? Not wanting to engage with the written instructions, perhaps. And I was hearing the students start to self and peer correct each other. You know, Johnny was saying, what do I do next? And Billy next to him saying, have you done step 3? Well, do step 4, you know, increase in independence, which was really good. And it gave them that visual cue during the practical and afterwards that they could, you know, go back a week later, a month later, and still talk about that practical quite effectively. So all of that was written up in a article in Journal of Chemical Education published last year. So it's been viewed over 500 times, which I'm quite happy about. And part of the process of doing this and blogging about it and talking about it online was to just put together all the AQA instructions for the so-called required practicals. So I just went through those because they were useful for myself, and I put them out, and they seem to be quite popular. I did all the physics practicals as well because I was teaching some GCSE physics last year, and then I couldn't leave it unfinished, so I've done all the biology practicals as well. Some of these biology practicals, when you kind of go down into what's required of them, they're pretty complex practicals. They take quite a bit of thinking, and making the integration instructions for some of these was quite challenging. It took me quite a while to work out how to break down the written instructions into easy pictorial diagrams. So the osmosis one was particularly interesting, and the one to the right of it, number 4, took a little bit of time to work out how they worked. They seem to be quite popular. They've been downloaded a few thousand times, and I get some good feedback from people that they've proved useful with their students. So plenty more on my blog, and I'm on Twitter. If you want to follow me, you can email me directly here, and there are some of the references, including the reference to my paper that I've talked about here. Thanks very much.